I'm a lecturer in the School of Forestry, and I'm going to talk to you about the Bachelor of Forestry Science. So what do forestry science and acupuncture have in common? I suppose there's a joke somewhere in there about needles, but the reality is not a lot. This article that came out a few weeks back highlighted something that's actually quite a serious problem throughout New Zealand. The article highlighted that, in fact, in 2013, there were more people who graduated with some kind of tertiary certificate in acupuncture than there were in forestry. And that despite forestry contributing about $4 billion to New Zealand's economy on an annual basis. So when I saw that headline, I was absolutely surprised. My head of department called me within hours of seeing it as well. And was like, can you believe this? This is absolutely incredible. And the reality is, I really struggle to believe it. I'm not really too sure why that result is occurring. But the reality is it's occurring not only in forestry, but across the sort of primary sectors as a whole. The current trend is that there are far too few graduates in the primary sectors. So what I want to talk to you guys about today is why you might actually choose to do forestry science at university and what types of careers it can lead to. So one of the things about forestry science is that it generally leads to sort of one of a number of great opportunities to join a multi-billion-dollar industry within New Zealand or worldwide. But there are a huge number of points of entry into forest industry. On one end, towards the lower end of the spectrum, you can work in tree felling or pruning or planting, sort of the manual labor jobs. On the other end of the spectrum, you can be a forest manager, a forest scientist, a forest ecologist. And the question that your students will need to address or will need to sort of ask of themselves is, where on the continuum do they want to be? Do they want to be sort of working in a forest every day with machinery, or do they want to be sort of managing the landscape and making important decisions about that forest? So the degree offering that we've got here at the University of Canterbury is a 4-year professional degree. It's a Bachelor of Forestry Science with honors. And this degree has been offered since 1925, on and off since 1925. So it's been around for quite some time now. And I guess since that time, our graduates have been leading sort of forest policy, forest management, forestry science in New Zealand and worldwide. One of the things that our degree does for you is that it equips you for a career in forest management or science. So those sort of career paths that are at the top of the forestry sector. And so I've mentioned forest science quite a bit now. What actually is forest science? It's something that I still haven't really addressed. I actually find it a little bit difficult to sort of sometimes describe what forest science is. So I like to begin by describing what forest science is not. This guy up here in the top right-hand corner, he works on a building site all day, swings a hammer on a building site all day. He's not a civil engineer, but he works with buildings all day. This woman down here, she works with money all day. She's not an accountant. She's not an economist. This guy who works on a chainsaw all day, he's not a forest scientist. He's not a forest manager. So the type of career that I'm talking about, this isn't the type of career that I'm talking about. And oftentimes, the forestry science degree gets perceived as a degree that outputs graduates who are going to wear hard hats and high vis and chainsaws all day. And that's not really what I'm talking about at all. So what is forestry science? Well, it's a complex combination of different sciences and management techniques that allows us to manage our forests for multiple end uses. Our graduates go on to lead teams of foresters. Our graduates go on to solve really complex forest science problems, such as, how do we balance the need for forest products with conservation goals and the benefits that we get from forest services? So just to sort of liven things up a little bit, I can ask, what do we get from forests? Wood, okay, there's one, big one. Most houses, most buildings made out of wood. What else? Oxygen, good. So that's a forest service. Now actually, let's just stop there. Wood and oxygen. Those two things are sort of mutually exclusive. You can either get wood, cut down the trees, or you can leave the trees standing and continue to have oxygen. So you can see there's this sort of subtle interchange that we need to get right if we want to get all of the forest products that we use on a daily basis, that we consume on a daily basis, but also continue to get the benefits from forest services. So it's a real challenge in order to make sure that we can get that balance right. How do we actually do that? The nice thing is New Zealand seems to have figured it out really well, actually. In New Zealand, about 5% of the landscape is treated as a crop, treated as a forest crop. So about 5% of the landscape is planted and managed for forest products, wood, paper. And that allows the country to set the rest of the forested land, about 25% of the landscape, set the rest of that aside and say, this is conservation land. We don't harvest this stuff anymore. This gets set aside for people to enjoy for birding, for walking, for orienteering, just for the aesthetic beauty of nature, and for all of those ecosystem services that we actually get. So that's one of the examples of the types of questions we explore throughout the degree. How about this one? How do we ensure our forests are safe from biosecurity risks? We live on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, so we're relatively well protected from biosecurity risks. But about 90% of our forest estate, the managed forest estate, the plantation forest estate, is one species, a species called radiata pine. If a pest were to somehow get into our country, a pest or a disease were to get into our country, that was able to sort of wipe out radiata pine, we would be in big trouble. That $4 billion industry that I started the presentation off with would succumb pretty quickly and become an industry worth probably a few thousand instead of $4 billion a year. This here is an example of what happens when a very small beetle called the mountain pine beetle infests forests in the northwestern US and the Pacific Northwest of Canada as well. The tiny little mountain pine beetle, many millions of them, attacked these forests and destroyed an area in a couple of years about the size of the South Island of New Zealand. So all of the trees on the entire South Island, all dead within a few years because of a single beetle. And so you can see there's a real serious consequence if we don't manage our biosecurity risks correctly in New Zealand. What about this one? How do we use forests to mitigate climate change? One of the things that's happened since my time in New Zealand, I arrived in 2006 from Canada. One of the things that's happened in Canterbury in particular is that log burners have been banned. And that's one way to manage climate change. We can stop the sources of atmospheric pollutants. But another way that we can actually manage or mitigate climate change is that we can plant forests. We can increase the number of sinks for atmospheric pollutants. So that's another one of the sort of complex questions that we address within the forestry science degree. I hope you can see it's a long way from a career on a chainsaw. It's a complex science that requires complex thought and I guess a particular type of student. These are our sort of nameless, faceless students here, but I can tell you that generally our students will be students who enjoy biology, they enjoy geography, hopefully they like stats or at least are numerate, and they certainly like the outdoors. You can always tell a forestry student because they're generally wearing plaid. They might be wearing Swan-Dry clothes, they might be wearing Kathmandu clothes, they might be wearing Macpac clothes. They're pretty recognizable people. So if you have people in your classes that fit that description, you can certainly expect that forestry science would be something that they'd probably enjoy. In terms of entry into the degree, there are no entry requirements. You need university entrance, of course. There are no strict subject requirements, but we find that students who have done biology and statistics in school tend to thrive in our degree. Those who haven't done it tend to struggle quite a bit more. During the time that the students spend with us, they're 4 years at the School of Forestry. We sort of mold them through sort of scholarships, academics, practical and professional development. The first thing of note is the scholarships. We have a small program. Between 20 and 25 students join our degree every single year. And we give away 13 first-year scholarships every single year. So about 50% of the students entering first year will receive a scholarship. We have a really good mixture of hands-on lab and field work, as well as the theory that you learn in the classroom. And of course, we've got an international exchange to the University of British Columbia or to Virginia Tech in the third year of the degree. So that's 6 months abroad to learn about forestry science at one of those two institutes, both of whom are probably within the top 5 in the world. We've got a really good practical component to the degree. It's one of the things our students really enjoy about the degrees. It's not all book learning. A good forestry scientist probably hasn't spent 40 hours a week behind a desk. There's a lot of outdoor field work to be done to be a good forest scientist or a good forest manager. Most of our courses include field trips, and we have a 90-day practical work requirements in order to get the degree. And then the final thing is sort of professional development. Our students are automatically enrolled in the New Zealand Institute of Forestry, and that gives them opportunities to meet and engage on a social and professional status with professional foresters in New Zealand, people who are eventually going to be their bosses or colleagues. So all of those four things, the scholarships, the academics, the practical, the professional, that takes our Year 13 student, and over the course of 4 years results in 95% employment. How do I know that? Well, we have small classes, and basically we track where our students go. So over the last decade, we have a 95% employment rate. And those are students going to good jobs. I'm not talking about going to get a job at Burger King or an acupuncture job. Sorry if any of you are acupuncturists. I'm talking good jobs in forestry science or in forest management or for the Department of Conservation or for Ministry of Primary Industries. Jobs starting somewhere between $45,000 and $50,000 a year. So I'll finish up with just a brief introduction to some of our graduates. These are graduates from our last 5 years, and you don't need to necessarily read everything about them or study their faces or anything like that, but the point that I'm trying to get across here is that our graduates go on to a range of different careers in a range of different areas within New Zealand and overseas. And you begin at sort of a graduate forester type role in many cases, or a lower level environmental forester type role, but the sky is the limit. These are a couple of our graduates from 1974 and 1979, respectively. Lou Sanson, many of you might be familiar with him. He's currently the Chief Executive and Director General of the Department of Conservation. Prior to that, he was the Chief Executive for Antarctic New Zealand. He's a graduate of the School of Forestry from back in the day. Jim Carl, 1974 graduate. He effectively had the top forestry job in the world for over a decade. He worked as a senior forestry officer for the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. So even though you start oftentimes locally in a fairly low caliber job earning $45,000 to $50,000 a year, the sky really is the limit with this type of degree. Final slide, just a personal anecdote really. I began my career, I did an undergraduate degree in computer science and I began in Canada. I got a job, I worked for a year behind a computer, doing 40 to 50 hours a week behind a computer. And I can tell you that it simply wasn't for me. I was one of those Kathmandu kids. I was one of those outdoor kids. And for some reason, I chose to become a computer scientist. That was a bad decision. I went back and did some qualifying courses, eventually got my master's degree in forestry science, came over here to do my PhD in forestry science, and now I'm a lecturer at the School of Forestry. So it's an important question to sort of ask of the young students what type of career they'd like to see themselves in for the next many decades. Please get in touch if you've got any further questions. Thank you.